A girl DM'd me and said she wanted to share her story about growing up in the Appalachian foothills in Kentucky and why you should never whistle at night. I'll be honest, I don't know much about Appalachian lore as I didn't grow up in Kentucky, but I asked my husband, whose family is from Kentucky. I said, were you ever told not to whistle at night? And he said, I was taught never to whistle at all. This is Jane's story. That is her real name, but she didn't want to be tagged. Jane started her email by saying that where she grew up in Kentucky, stories weren't just stories. They were lessons and they were warnings passed down from generation to generation. Jane grew up in a small 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house with her mother and her grandmother. Their closest neighbor was 3 miles away. The house had been in their family for generations. Her great-grandfather had built it himself. Jane's mother worked most days, so she was often left alone with her grandmother. Growing up, Jane was allowed to go play and explore the woods, often unsupervised, but generally her grandmother would be on the front porch in a rocking chair, smoking cigarettes, drinking coffee, and staying within close range. Jane's grandmother was a staunch believer in the idea that kids should be kids and often encouraged her to go and play. Jane says she learned a lot about nature living there. She would always find tadpoles, bring them home and watch them turn into frogs. She would find bugs, build them small habitats. She would watch the baby deer grow up every spring and summer. But Jane's grandmother had 2 rules, and the first was that Jane had to be in the house by dusk, and the second was that Jane could not whistle at night, even if she was in the house. When Jane asked why she wasn't allowed to whistle at night, her grandmother only ever said, "It calls them to you," and refused to elaborate. So Jane grew up with the idea that there were monsters or people in the woods that would come if you whistled. So Jane grows up, she goes off to college. Her mother had since fell in love with and married a man who lived in the suburbs of Louisville. So only her grandmother is left living in this house. And Jane doesn't go back very often. There's not a lot for her there. And at this point in her life, she views the place where she grew up just as a small mountain town where a lot of old people live who still believe in magic and folklore. But Jane's modern. She's a millennial. She has a smartphone. She watches The Bachelorette. The world that she lives in is bigger and more vibrant than the dusty old stories that her grandmother clung to. But obviously her grandmother's lessons are ingrained in her. She was raised that way. So anytime she hears somebody whistle, especially after dark, she kind of thinks to herself, you're not supposed to do that. But of course she never says anything. She doesn't want to be weird. When she's a junior in college, she's going back to her grandmother's house for Christmas. Her mother and her mother's new husband are also going to be there. She drives a day early to go stay with her grandmother. Her grandmother is older, she's getting sick, and Jane doesn't know how much time she's going to have left with her. Before she gets to the house, she stops at the general store in the last town to get a Red Bull and some snacks before taking the long, twisty road to her grandmother's house. She pulls up the long driveway, parks her car, and as she gets out, for some reason, she's just struck with the urge to whistle. She says she doesn't know what it was. Something about being there just gave her the urge. The sun was about set, but it wasn't completely dark, and she lets out this long, high-pitched whistle. She says she stopped and looked around because she half expected something to happen, but nothing did. All she heard was the wind through the trees. So she goes up, knocks on the door, and her grandmother answers. Her grandmother welcomes her in, asks her if she wants some tea, and the two go out to the front porch where they had spent so much time when Jane was growing up. They're sitting there for about an hour, and there's a break in conversation when Jane notices something is off. She says there was no wind, the air was completely still. Keep in mind, it's December, but it's a relatively warm night in December. All the trees are barren, no leaves, nothing moving, complete stillness. And then they hear a whistle in the woods. And it's Jane's whistle. The same long, high-pitched whistle that Jane had whistled earlier. And her grandmother grabs a chair, her knuckles going white, and she stands up and she says, "Did you whistle at night?" And Jane starts stammering because this actually scares her. And she's like, "Well, I did when I got here, but it wasn't quite dark, and I didn't think anything was going to happen." Her grandmother's like, "We have to go inside right now." So the two go inside where there's a fire going, and they hear the whistle again, but it's closer this time. Her grandmother's sitting in the chair close to the fire, and she's like, "Why did you do that? I told you never to whistle at night." And Jane still doesn't entirely know what's going on, so she just says, "Well, who is it? Who's whistling?" And her grandmother just says, "We don't know, but you called them and now they're here." Her grandmother reassures her that they're going to be safe as long as they stay inside when there's a pounding at the door. The pounding at the door startled Jane, so she jumps up, and then she realizes that it's probably just her mother and her husband. So she goes over to answer it, and her grandmother just looks at her and she says, "What are you doing?" And Jane says, "Is Mom coming early?" And her grandmother says, "No." She tells her to come sit back down, so she does, and then it's gone. Jane says she has absolutely no explanation. She does not know what it was, but thinking about the experience still terrifies her. And her grandmother has sadly since passed away, and Jane inherited the house, but she says she still has not gone back there. She doesn't know if she ever will, and she's not sure what she's going to do with the house. If you're from the foothills of Kentucky or the Appalachia area in general, please comment and let Jane know what you think she experienced. She will be seeing these comments. And keep sending me your spooky, scary stories. You can DM them to me on my profile page, or my email is also in my bio. I will keep adding those stories to this playlist. Do good, stay bad.